Welcome to the Stefan Levira podcast.
All right, guys, welcome to the show. And my guest today is Rusty. Welcome, Rusty.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about you, Rusty. So just to quickly introduce you to the listeners, Rusty is a very well-known and respected developer within Bitcoin and Lightning, and he previously came from a background of Linux kernel development. So he currently works at Blockstream as part of the Elements project on the Blockstream Lightning implementation, known as C Lightning. And on top of that, he's also written some great articles and given some really cool talks on Bitcoin development, such as his talk, Future Technological Directions in Bitcoin. But yeah, the thing I was hoping to start with today was your article, The Three Economic Eras of Bitcoin. So in this article, you basically say the way the Bitcoin ecosystem will play out is written in the mathematics of its consensus rules. We should all know the three phases it will go through. Now, I thought this was a really prescient article, and you showed a lot of foresight. So can you give us a bit of a background on this one, Rusty?
Yeah, sure. I think that came partially from my frustration with the events leading up to what became the big block size debate. And that was really that, we knew this transition to fees was going to happen, right? This was always written there, right? Mining rewards, the free money phase was going to end, and we were going to enter into this, the free offer is over, you have to pay for your Bitcoin now. And I think it was kind of glossed over and grossly unappreciated in the early days. Partially, I think, because it was so far away, but also because there's a kind of boosterism, you're with us or against us. It was, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And, any kind of message that contained caution or, like there be dragons or, things ahead was very much attenuated, right? So it led to this kind of this case where people were like, but I thought Bitcoin was instant and free and everything else. And it's like, well, whoa, that it was never those things, right? Bitcoin was free when nobody wanted it. Satoshi made it very clear in the paper that the plan was to transition across to a fee basis, supported by inflation to begin with, but that was supposed to taper out. Right. So, when you have people going, but hold on, fees are too high and everything like that, you go, look, they may be higher than, you may prefer at the moment, but we were always going to have this at some point. Right. And the argument is, well, should it be now? Should it be later? But with no centralized control to put their hand on the lever, it's going to happen when it's going to happen. And so people who were horrified by what Bitcoin had become, I was amazed that these people, how did they get this impression that Bitcoin was going to be like, this free money system the whole time? And so for that started me thinking, right, okay, so it was the first phase where basically, nobody wanted Bitcoin. It was completely free. You could just send as much as you wanted around the world. There was no fees. It was all great, right? That early bootstrapping phase, the Satoshi's free money phase. But, it was quite clear that was going to end. I think we've seen this with any service that starts free and then you try to charge for it, right? There's going to be a certain number of users who go, but I thought it was always going to be free. And in Bitcoin's case, it was very clear that this was going to end. And seeing people's reactions to that, that transition made me realize that, we're very early on in that change, right? You got a little taste of fees, right? But that's going to be the norm. If Bitcoin is to survive and become self-sustaining, the mining fees, the miners who secure the network are going to be paid by you and me on a transaction basis, right? Every transaction is going to have to chip in something. Now, ideally, we'll get as many transactions to share that burden as possible. But, it's never going to be enough. You do the math and you go, well, what if you have 1 cent transaction fees and we want to pay the miners $1 billion a year? Well, that's going to be huge, unattainable blocks. So it's going to be somewhere in the middle, right? Fees are going to be, higher than you would hope. I'd bet, as low as they can be because we cram as many transactions in as we can. So that's where we're headed, and we're not there yet. So, there is going to be like this third phase. So hence the three economic eras. At one point, it's going to become inevitable that on-chain is going to cost, real money. And you're not going to have these, even when it was busy, you tended to get things would lull on the weekends, for example, right? So you could get cheaper transactions through on the weekends because traffic would drop again. At some stage, people will have optimized for all these tricks, and we'll get a pretty steady flow, and it will keep fees high. And that has to happen because that's what's paying for the network. And given people's reactions so far, and they're how incredulous they were that this was the way Bitcoin worked, I don't think that message has really gotten out there. So I do anticipate that there will be a push as that becomes a reality for these businesses who've built their whole business on this idea that Bitcoin is free, that transactions are trivially small. They will push back against the idea, and they will, I think the obvious thing for them to do is to advocate for a hard fork, which just continues to inflate Bitcoin.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Hey, why should the people using Bitcoin pay for it? Why shouldn't the people just holding Bitcoin pay for it, right? That's the inflation argument. And so, I think it's important to kind of make that clear so people aren't blindsided by it. There's going to be a very, very strong push to break the 21 million Bitcoin cap. And to continue to pay the miners. The miners will obviously be in favor of it because free money, right? And the big businesses who are transacting on the network, the accountants there will go, hey, we are paying, we're having to charge our customers, $500 million a year. We could pass those costs on to the rest of the network and not have to pay it ourselves, right? So they will definitely advocate for it. And I think there's rational economic reasons to argue one way or the other, but it doesn't really matter because I think it's pretty clear that Bitcoin was defined, and people bought into Bitcoin on this idea that there was a $21 million limit. So I think it's going to be extremely strong pushback, but that doesn't mean that people won't try. So I certainly expect this third phase where, as I said, I think in the article, the third phase is going to begin with civil war. There is going to be this massive push by interested parties, particularly those who built their business on cheap transactions, to keep them cheap and use inflation to support the network.
Yeah, sure. And I think just to sort of keep it accessible for the sort of newbies, what we'll do is just kind of explain a little bit around how Bitcoin's structure is. Could you just outline a little bit around what is that pressure that drives the fees up?
Right. Okay. Well, that's actually not such a sort of a beginner question, really. So sort of from a high level, with the miners are rewarded by minting new coins, right? And every 4 years that halves. So it started at 50 Bitcoin, went to 25, it's now 12.5. In another 2 years, it'll drop to 6.25. The other money that miners get is from Bitcoin fees, right? Every transaction pays a fee. Now, because there's a limited amount of transactions they can cram into each block, obviously miners choose the one that pay the most fees per weight, right? So given the size of the transaction, they take the ones that'll basically give them the most money. And that means when there is pressure when there's more transactions that will fit in a block, that leads to this kind of bidding war, where those who pay most will get their transactions mined first. They will be processed first. Now, particularly when we went through the last fee spike, when transaction volume exceeded the block capacity, and that's before we had the block size increase that was segued, we saw some crazy. It peaked at something. Average transactions paying things like 55 US and stuff like that. That was actually pretty unusual, but we did see some spikes, and a part of that was the infrastructure wasn't there. People couldn't deal with it, right? So you had websites basically saying, this is the transaction fee. If you want your money, that's what you're going to have to pay. They didn't give you an option, hey, if you're prepared to wait a little bit, perhaps we could try a lower fee. It was very, very primitive because there had never been this crisis before. So as a result, fees spiked. I mean, imagine, you've got $60 in this website. It says, do you want your money? It's going to cost $55 to get out. You complain, but it doesn't present you with any other options. So damn it, that's what you pay, right? And we saw people doing that. They were complaining about transaction fees, but they were still paying it. Things have gotten a lot better with stuff like that, with replaced by fee, so that you can, once again, like you used to be able to in the original Bitcoin days, send a transaction and then replace it, if you go, okay, well, I kind of lowballed that fee. I've been waiting half an hour, still not through. Let's replace it with a slightly more generous one. Which gives you a lot more ability to control your fees. And software is getting more sophisticated as well. So, next time we have a fee spike, we're hopefully in a much better place to deal with this. And it won't be so. There'll still be people who will just throw money at it. If you're transferring $100 million, you pay a $50 fee. You don't care. But for the rest of us, I think, having more sophisticated software will definitely help with this sort of bidding process.
Sure. How about... Sorry, go on.
No, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, related to that, could you talk a little bit about how fee estimation was very basic in the past and how that's gotten better?
Right. So fee estimation, I would argue fee estimation is still pretty basic. You're trying to guess. So the problem is blocks don't come in every 10 minutes, right? They come in, approximately, average every 10 minutes. But, there's some probability that it will take 40 minutes before someone gets lucky, right? Or it could come in really fast. So you can tell just from that, it's almost impossible to guess how much you would have to pay to get in, some like the second block or something. You don't know how long it'll be. You don't know, how much things will pile up, right? You're kind of trying to get in there so you're in that first chunk of transactions, the best transactions. You don't need to be the best. You just need to be good enough that the miner will go, great, I can include that in your block. So you're trying to hit that cutoff. And over time, more people will come in with more transactions. And if it's been a while between blocks, that's going to increase. People are going to go, well, I really, really want this in. And they'll start bidding higher and higher. So it is actually kind of a hard problem. We've gotten slightly better at handling it with software. But more importantly, the ability to replace things by fee means you can start low. You can guess conservatively and go, I'm going to guess and hope this slides in. And then I can replace it later if I have to, right? And that was missing in a lot of software last time we had the fee spike. So you kind of went, I don't want to get stuck with this transaction that never confirms. So damn it, I'm going to go cautious and I'm going to bid high on the fees. And when everyone does that, of course, you create this problem that, if everyone's bidding high, you have no choice but to bid high as well. So I think that itself will significantly change the factors when we see fee pressure.
Sure. And I think there were some other factors you mentioned in the article in the second era, Satoshi's subsidy, and you mentioned a few underlying reasons behind why Bitcoin developers were reluctant to so-called naively increase the on-chain block size or block weight. And a few reasons you mentioned were it's a one-off bump hazard, the devs want to follow the community, and also software and services we're still preparing, and that also transitions should be gradual. Can you outline a little bit of the thinking on that?
Yeah. So, the obvious thing was, crap, fees are too high. We should enlarge. We should enlarge the blocks. We should just allow more transactions in every block, right? And the pushback against that was, that we knew fees were going to get, uncomfortably high at some point, right? Nobody's going to be happy paying $1 billion a year to miners, right? So, the argument then becomes, but not now, right? Just not yet, right? But that argument is a very slippery slope, right? When are people going to turn out, no, now is a good time to have high fees? They're not going to, right? So, there's always been an argument that you should try to kick the can down the road. So it was, that was a reason not to do it. But also, doing the enlargement itself is problematic because previously, when we had seen a block size increase, which had happened in a couple of previous occasions, it had definitely driven huge amounts of centralization. And the reason is that as a miner, the longer it takes for your blocks to propagate, the more chance that somebody else pips you and gets in before you do. So bigger blocks actually make it harder to profitably mine. But if you're a really big miner, then that gives you a significant advantage of everyone else because your chances are you're going to find the next block yourself, in which case, obviously, you don't worry about how long it takes for the rest of the world to find out about your block. And so we definitely saw in practice that miners all jumped onto the hugest pool they could find when blocks jumped and they started, feeling that they had more chance of losing out. Because of this block propagation problem. The developers have certainly spent a lot of effort trying to improve block propagation. But They're very cautious about that. The other thing is that enlarging, doing a naive, just double it kind of thing, will be the first backwards incompatible change since Bitcoin's introduction, right? A so-called hard fork. Previously, everything has been backwards compatible. Like if you can dig out a 0.32 version of Bitcoin, in theory at least, with a couple of bug fixes, you can sync that to today's Bitcoin, right? It will accept the chain. It won't get upset at any point. So it's a big deal to force everyone to upgrade. You have been allowed to run, old versions of Bitcoin. They will still work. So the developers feel that's a big deal. It has to be really, really critical to force everybody to change their software. But the other thing which was really interesting is that, despite the fact that we knew fees were coming, they were going to do this and everything else, very few people proved to be prepared for it. Bitcoin Core had fee estimation and they'd pushed, replaced by fee and everything else. But everyone else was pretty much caught with their pants down. So it's pretty clear that unless there's actual pressure, people will defer it and they'll be working on other stuff. So large companies that should know better still these days are not batching transactions or doing other things. They're just grossly unprepared for the next fee spike. So it's pretty horrible to see, to sort of treat it this way. But you go, well, if we give them relief now, then they won't ever do that work, right? They're never going to actually get their act together. And, so there's like a second order of kicking the can down the road where they start relying on the stuff that or the fact that you will just save them again next time. And they'll never actually, do the optimizations that they need to handle this case.
Sure. And that in some ways they were, the large miners were in a sense would get themselves a bit of a protective moat if the blocks are larger. And some businesses are able to basically socialize their costs rather than do the engineering work required to, use up less of the blockchain, so to speak.
That's
so
right.
Could you outline some of the techniques that businesses can, or perhaps in your view, maybe they should be using to try and minimize the impact on the blockchain, such as transaction batching, etc.
Yeah, so transaction batching is the obvious one, right? If you're paying out regular payments, you can actually group those together because so I'm paying you like $10 for something. Usually, what happens is I don't have a $10 output to spend, so I take a $100 output, I pay you 10, and I pay 90 and change back to me, right? But if I'm paying two people at once, it scales quite well because I have, $10 to you, $10 to someone else, and $80 change to me, right? That's transaction batching, right? So you can get, almost a factor of 2 improvement just by batching your transactions together. Sometimes that means just, you only send out one big transaction every 5 minutes or something. Sometimes it means you do slightly smarter things where you send out like a really low fee transaction that pays to you, so you instantly see it, and then come along later with a replacement transaction that pays sort of a more reasonable higher fee, but batches all of the payments I've sent out previously. Now, that's the technology to do that is still kind of really kind of sinking in, but that's definitely the way we will see the large organizations going, and many of them do. Many exchanges already batch. Some of them, in fact, did that for quite a while. Surprisingly, some of the large organizations still do not batch their payments, and it's not clear why they're not doing that. Maybe they're burning VC money and they don't care. Maybe there's a point of pride in going, hey, we're responsible for 30% of the transaction volume. Even if that's a completely meaningless and in fact a negative statistic, perhaps that's part of their pitch deck, right? When they're trying to raise more money, this is what they say. Hey, we're dominant in the space because we use more block space than everyone else. So that's just a pet theory of mine. It may be completely false. But also,
but that's a funny way of putting it.
Yeah, but also some of these businesses are built on Bitcoin as if it's a finished thing, right? They kind of went, cool. Well, our business is, doing KYC and doing, getting licenses and all that stuff. And the Bitcoin stuff is really, it's something we sit on top of, right? And this is something we see. The free rider kind of problem is something we see a lot in the open source world early on, when people really didn't understand that if you're basing your business on something, you need to be involved in its development. Bitcoin is not a finished product. There are still improvements to be made. And if you're not in there, then one, you're going to be unaware of how to use it well. But also, I think it develops this kind of distrust between the people who are actually doing the work and you trying to earn money off them. And I think that makes, it's unstable if you kind of take it for granted. And I think this is a lesson that's slowly being learned in the Bitcoin space. Unfortunately, we're seeing more support of, the core development that so many companies are relying on for their valuations.
Yeah. All right. And now in your article, one quote that you use from Satoshi Nakamoto is, once a predetermined number of coins have entered circulation, the incentive can transition entirely to transaction fees and be completely inflation free. So now the question then is, do you think Satoshi, whoever he, she, they are, do you think they thought it would happen this soon, or do you think they were thinking more like 2140?
Definitely before 2140, right? I mean, because it's an exponential decay. So 2140 is the point at which the last Satoshi block reward is paid out, right? This last block subsidy is paid out, right? But it's insignificant long before then. In fact, we're already down a quarter from the original, right? We'll be down to an eighth of the original amount when in a couple of years' time. So we've already seen a couple of cases of the fees in blocks being sort of comparable with half of the current block reward. So it's quite possible that becomes more normal, but certainly I would expect in the next 10 years, so another like 3 halvings, by that point, we really are getting down to an eighth of what you're getting paid now for each block. I think it's pretty clear that it was going to be in the sort of the 10 to 25 year range of Bitcoin that this would happen. But of course, it depends a lot on the actual value of a Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin doubles in price, then it doesn't matter that the reward halves. And so there's a huge external factor there, adding this big random component. But it was pretty clear, it would have been pretty clear at the time that, after 7 halvings, you're down to 128th of the original point. That's looking pretty lean. Right, so it was pretty clear that transition would happen, within sort of my lifetime, kind of thing. It was never going to be like 2100.
Yeah, sure. And as you mentioned, if the Bitcoin price doubles every 4 years, in fiat terms, obviously, this then at least counterbalances the block subsidy that's halving every 4 years. And then once you add in transaction fees, and I wonder whether that would be enough.
Yeah, so that's interesting, but I mean, at some point it really does vanish, and you can't keep doubling forever.
Yeah, sure.
So the other thing is that at the moment, as a miner, most of your costs probably are in some kind of fiat currency. But if Bitcoin becomes more successful, then that will change. So the tone of the conversation changes. If you're not converting all your Bitcoin, then suddenly, I think that a Bitcoin is a Bitcoin, right? So the fact that the reward is paying less Bitcoins does become an issue. But also we've seen obviously the cost to run the network now is a lot higher than it was when it was Satoshi and his first peer, whoever that was, right? So, at the moment we're paying, I haven't done the sums recently, but, we kind of said, I think I had some rough numbers based on the previous Bitcoin price in the article on what we were paying for mining. And I think it's well in excess of $1 billion a year. So in practice, the price going up of Bitcoin just means that we spend more money on mining. So there's a valid question of how much money do we need to spend on mining? How secure do we need the network to be? And the number is pretty high. If you're using real economic value across Bitcoin, you need to make the cost of attacking it equally large. So even if Bitcoin gets even if Bitcoin goes up in value, then you could argue that you need that value, you need that reward for miners because now you're protecting more stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's an interesting piece that you're making, a point that you're making there, that there are multiple moving pieces here. So obviously you got the price of Bitcoin, but then you've also got the so-called level of security that Bitcoin provides. I mean, at various points in Bitcoin's life or cycle, it may have been quote unquote over providing security or under providing the kind of socially desired level of security. So as you said, it could just simply provide slightly less security or more, depends on how much people want to spend for that. The next thing I was curious to get your thoughts on is, could you outline just some of your thoughts on what happened with the late 2017, the No2x saga.
Wow. Okay, so that's obviously a big topic, right?
Yeah. Oh well. Basically, what I was trying to understand is, do you think this coming battle could be resolved in a similar way to that No2x saga?
Right. Well, it was kind of heartening to see some people come out of the woodwork and say, well, no, look, that is not how we run Bitcoin. And some of that, I think some of those lessons have been learned now. As I said, some of the big businesses are now more aware of how to interact with a real open source project. So I previously worked for IBM, and when IBM started to get involved in Linux and stuff, they had this real, who's in charge problem, right? Like, if you've got this top-down corporate hierarchy, it's used to dealing with another top-down organization, and it did their head in to try to they wanted to have a deal with an entity, right? But this chaotic group of ever-shifting developers really took some effort. And the fact that there was a significant amount of money involved, I think they really went through that exercise of figuring out how to deal with that. And there's a whole industry now around Linux that now knows how to deal with open source developments and open source developers and the kind of the chaotic models that they have. And I think we're seeing the same lessons learned in the Bitcoin space, right? So I think you can look at like the No2x stuff as an interesting lesson in how not to interact with the community and the responses that you will get if you try that. So I do think that it was interesting. It is heartening to see people stand up and say, no, actually, this is not how Bitcoin works, right? You can't just sign a deal with someone and say, right, we've changed the rules for Bitcoin. And it's good that is not how it works. But also the understanding that that's not how it works means that people learn how to interact with the sort of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and because if things gridlock, then at least we get Bitcoin as it is today, right? It doesn't get any better, but it doesn't get any worse. You still keep your Bitcoin, right? Yeah. And so that is the default outcome of any activity in the Bitcoin space. If there's no overwhelming consensus, nothing changes. And really, that's as sucky as that might be, as sucky as it might have been if we hadn't got SegWit, if it really had been this untenable, complete lack of consensus, Bitcoin would still be there, right? It would still work just the same as before. It wouldn't have some improvements, wouldn't have some tweaks, wouldn't have some things that we really wanted, but it would have kept going. And I think that lesson is really important. And somebody, in the heat of that whole, everyone was fretting about what was going to happen, somebody kind of pulled me aside and said, Bitcoin will survive this. Worst thing that happens is nothing changes. And really, when you're looking at defaults, that's probably the best default you can have. If there's no consensus, if everyone doesn't agree, nothing moves. And I think that has now somewhat been learned. Although I suspect, as Bitcoin becomes more popular, more people come on board, they may have to learn that lesson 2 or 3 times before it sticks.
Sure, yeah, and I think we may see more debates and battles come in Bitcoin as these kinds of things come back and back again. And I think it was interesting to see many people in the community community quote unquote were using things like hats to sort of signal their that their allegiances. Do you think Samson will make a killing selling hats with 21 million on them?
Yeah, look, it is quite possible that we will see the same kind of hat-driven barometer of community feeling out there. I hadn't thought that, but maybe I should get in line for one of those 21 million hats. Yeah, so it was important that people felt empowered, right? So people may have these opinions and may not want things to change, but they may also go, well, how am I going to oppose some of these giant companies and things? And I think developing that sense of community made people feel like, oh, actually, there are enough of us that we can actually make this work. So I think the social side of hats and stuff like that actually is important for people to feel they're not just, tilting against windmills and knowing that there's a broad base of support for this stuff. I honestly hope that I'm wrong about the third era and that people will learn their lessons before then, but I suspect, given what we've seen, people will give it a red hot go.
Yeah, and it may be that the fact that you have now pointed this out and the fact that people are talking about it helps people learn in advance for next time. So I think that's another thing to think about.
Yeah, definitely. One of the reasons I published this was to try to inoculate people against this, so that they recognize what it is when it comes. It won't, it may well be guised in, look, we got these Nobel Prize winning economists, and they suggest that the system is far better if we have 1%, inflation and things like that. But I think it's important to see where the motivation is from those players, so you can kind of see through the rationalization of what they're doing. So I think that is important.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I think that's a good way to finish off that particular part of the discussion. Let's now change to discussing about your current work in terms of Lightning and the Elements project at Blockstream. But first, Rusty, if we could just keep this accessible for the intelligent layman, can you just give a quick background on what is Lightning and what are the key benefits for Bitcoin?
Right. Okay. That's certainly something that we can do. So Bitcoin is this great system of money transfer and everything else, but it is a heavy system, right? So every time you want to spend, move some Bitcoin, spend it, give it to someone else, everyone on the Bitcoin network, finds out about it. They all validate it. It goes to everyone. It all happens, and then 10 minutes later or so, it gets into a block, and then and then it gets under enough blocks, and people go, "Yep, definitely, it's pretty much nailed there. We accept that now." That's a really, really heavy process. So, and we talked about why you can't just scale it up, and that large blocks tend to cause centralization, and you'll end up with a couple of big miners. And then why were you doing all this work in the first place? It turns out that about 3.5 years ago, a paper was released detailing a system you can build on top of this, where two parties will basically put some Bitcoin in, and then they will basically be able to trade it between themselves, and they'll just by swapping transactions. So they put some Bitcoin in, they both have to sign in order to spend it, and they agree that say $10 is going to you, Stefan, and I'm taking and I'm taking $20, and then I pay you, and so we change it. Okay, let's have a new transaction. It pays you 20, it pays me 10, and we can shuffle money back and forth between ourselves all the time just by swapping these signed Bitcoin transactions, knowing that at any point we can take the latest one and we can just kind of drop it on chain to actually get our money. And because we know we can do that, we don't have to. We can just hold these in our back pocket, and as long as you're still around, we can just swap these transactions back and forth. So this was called a payment channel. And so the idea was that two parties could basically pay each other rapidly back and forth, eventually closing out by spending the last transaction that they traded with the other party.
Yeah, sure.
So this was okay, that's pretty cool. I could, so that's one way of amortizing costs, right? Because we only have to have two Bitcoin transactions, one to open this channel, and then one to close it, and we can do hundreds or even thousands of transactions. That's great if I want to pay you hundreds or thousands of times, and there are some models where that actually works, but it doesn't let me pay anyone else. The Lightning paper did a couple of interesting things. One is, originally these channels were single directional. I could pay you, but you couldn't use the same channel to pay me. You had to have a separate one. So these are single one-way channels. The Lightning paper introduced a method of doing these two-way channels, which was kind of interesting. But more importantly, I think, they introduced this idea that if I've got a channel to you and you have a channel to Joe over there, I can actually use you to pay Joe without trusting you. Right? I don't have to send you $1 and say, hey, can you pay this to Joe? There's this way of making sure that I can do a conditional payment to you and says, okay, cool. Here's $1. If you pay 99 cents to Joe, he'll give you the secret, and that will let you get the money off me. Right? And this is all written in the scripting language, the smart contracts that go on the blockchain. So it's really, really hard. As long as Bitcoin still works, right? You can guarantee that this payment will work. It will either go through or it will fail. And the only way it will succeed is if you actually make the payment almost to Joe. And so these channels now form a whole network. You can kind of send payments through all these parties, and you don't have to trust them. The worst they can do is not forward your payment. And these things have a timeout. So, worst things that happen, they time out, and it fails. But the incentive is that you pay a tiny fee to them to try to succeed. So they only get paid if they succeed. So obviously it's in their interest to try to make sure this stuff works. And that produces this, what is now called the Lightning Network. So this paper dropped 3.5 years ago of here's something cool we could do. But interestingly, the two people who wrote the paper, Taj Dreijer and Joseph Poon weren't actually going to implement it. They were like, well, that's kind of cool, but we have day jobs, right? And that happened to be the time that I was joining Blockstream. And I read the paper, couldn't make head or tails of it. It had a lot of, it was like really, really dense and kind of scattered. But finally, after the third time I read it, I figured out all the pieces. They'd kind of described all the trees, but never the forest. And so I wrote a series of blog posts on, hey, here's how to understand the Lightning paper. And so I'd kind of pull those pieces together so that anyone could kind of understand what the potential was here. And then when I was finally joining Blockstream, CTO Greg Maxwell said, we've decided you should work on Lightning, right? Because, you wrote some blog posts, you've got to be like an expert, right? so I was like, oh, okay. Mainly because it was one of those technologies that we really wanted to exist, right? The fact that we've been shown it was possible to build this kind of thing on top of Bitcoin meant obviously we wanted it to exist. It would make Bitcoin much more usable. It would be great for our clients and everything else. Since no one else was doing it, it made sense for us to step up and try to push that technology forward. So we started playing with it. We did some refinements on the the formulations in the paper, and we started working towards it. But we weren't the only ones. Taj and Joseph did actually end up forming a company to develop Lightning, and then another company, Async, in Paris, decided also to do a Lightning implementation. And then about 2 years ago in Milan, we had a summit. The three groups kind of came together and thrashed out what the canonical spec for this would look like, because nobody really wanted to have 3 different implementations which didn't work together. Right, we wanted a single network, so we had to agree on all the protocol details and everything else. And we were optimistic after we did that it'll take 6 months for us to get something working. And of course, this is software, so it took 18 months. But now we're at the stage where the Lightning clients or something, they're all kind of in beta, and they're all cautions all over them, right? Don't put in any money you can't afford to lose. So think a network for beer money rather than massive high finance. But this is something you can install, and you can make payments through the Lightning network. And at this stage, it's pretty much the motivation is you can encourage us to find the bugs and test stuff and play around with it. And you can buy hats and stickers from the Blockstream Lightning store, and there are a few other places that you can spend your hard-earned Satoshis and things like that. So we're definitely in that sort of alpha kind of early beta stage.
Sure. Yeah, and then so there are 3 main implementations or 3 big teams who are working on it. So I think there's Async, the French, the Paris team, and then you've got the L&D software by Lightning Labs.
Yep.
And for listeners, just check out episode 9 of my podcast. That is with Brian Vu. He's the VP of product at Lightning Labs. And then finally, you guys. So tell us a little bit about C Lightning and what you guys are working on, and maybe just tell us a little bit about how it's being used out in the wild.
Yeah, so C Lightning. I mean, I'm a C programmer, so I wrote Lightning D, and to differentiate from the others, we decided to call it we've kind of rebranded it to C Lightning. Although the fact that it's implemented in C is really kind of an implementation detail for geeks, but that name seemed to have stuck. So we're more server side, so everyone else is pretty good at making payments. We're optimized for kind of receiving payments. You're running a storefront. Most of the time you want to receive payments. You're not making a huge number. So we don't have a mobile client, for example, although there is a nice mobile remote control for it now. But it's basically it's a server class kind of implementation. And most of our time is spent these days is trying to keep up with the spec, because there are a whole bunch of options that we've added to the spec to support different use cases, as we've discovered, pain points that people have and things like that. So at the moment, it's very much sort of chasing those optional spec things. Just improving UX. Some performance work in there. We run reasonably comfortably on a Raspberry Pi, but you do need a full Bitcoin node at the moment. And one of the big areas of work is trying to, how much of a light node can we still run have decent security and run at that point. And that work's being led really by the L&D team from Lightning Labs. They're doing some really great work.
The Neutrino, right?
The Neutrino stuff is mind blowing, and it's it's really independent of Lightning. It's just a roast beef. Lalu, their head programmer, basically went, I hate all the light client options that we have at the moment. We basically need a new protocol, and went ahead with that. So I'm really looking forward to that getting into Bitcoin Core, and there's some great theoretical work, and that will benefit all the boats, even if you're not using Lightning. I expect the next generation of light clients to use Neutrino really heavily, and it's much nicer for privacy. So there's been some side benefits like that have been just really fantastic to see, and it's certainly something that we're itching to implement as well. So try not to get distracted, but it is very cool tech. So that may come along. As an open source project, of course, we get people coming by and contributing stuff. And we go, well, okay, we didn't plan to include that, but thanks. We'll put that in now, like way ahead of schedule. For example, we have Tor support, and it was kind of, we wanted Tor support at some point, but a contributor came by and just basically dropped Tor support in our laps, and so that was like, great, thank you. That's included in the 0.6 release.
Oh, very nice.
So yeah, it does make it hard for me to kind of give a roadmap. I can talk about the things that I'm working on, which is stuff in front of me, but there's always these surprises. The other thing that's happening is not enough of my time, but as much as I can spare goes into try to maintain the spec and kind of keep that that collaboration going, because the spec is really the ground document on which all the implementations are based. You can't write a spec in isolation. You need to kind of play with things and go, okay, that didn't work, and that feeds back into the spec. And all three teams are very active in getting that spec together. But the 1.0 beta spec has been out for a while, and we're looking at kind of a 1.1 with some significant enhancements, all of which will be backwards compatible, and that will be kicked off in November. We're having the second summit, a Lightning Developer Summit. The final invitations went out actually just this morning because I'm slack and was meant to do it last month. But that will actually be held in Adelaide. So it will be kind of cool to have all these Lightning devs in my hometown. Get to show them around and spend a couple of days geeking out over the Lightning protocol.
Yeah, so excellent. So what are some potential developments or features that you guys might be tossing around at that meetup?
Right. So it's pretty clear that splicing in and splicing out are really important. So at the moment you have a channel, but if you want to get funds out of the channel onto chain, or you want to beef the channel up, we decided for 1.0, you shut the channel down, you start a new one. But in theory, you can have add funds into the channel from on-chain. You want to put some more money in, or hey, I actually want to pay someone on-chain. I've got funds in my channel. Can we, splice payments out and do that without any downtime? So instead of having to bring your channel down and then get a new transaction through and everything else, you can do that while you're still using the channel normally. And that's definitely something that will be a hot topic in November, and exactly the details of how we do that and how that negotiation occurs. That's kind of important. One of the other things that we're probably going to change is at the moment I said you trade back and forth these transactions, right? So you're holding this transaction so that if something goes wrong, you can just drop that on the blockchain and get your money that way. The problem is, of course, fees. You talked about this before, fee prediction, and I talked about the difficulties of doing that. Well, the problem with holding a transaction that's pre-signed by the other side and you're ready to go is you don't know when you're going to need it, and fee prediction is hard in the short term, but trying to do it in the long term, you might want this in a month's time. What a fee's going to be is really hard, and so we kind of punted and went, well, we'll grossly overpay fees, but even that may be insufficient. And it turns out that you may not agree what grossly overpaying fees is. The other side may go, that's too low. I want the fees to be higher. And you may go, no, that's ridiculous. I'm not paying ridiculously high fees. I think you're insane, right? So it turns out this is actually a significant problem. So we're actually probably going to change the basis of the way the transactions work so that they will pay minimum fees, and you will basically attach a parent transaction that at the time you want to spend it to basically push this transaction through. So that way you don't have to guess in advance what the fees are going to be, and that's one of our pain points at the moment. So that's something else going to go through in November. We've already got some discussion around that. But one of the other things on the flip side is the ability to split payments. So at the moment you've got to find the case I want to pay Joe. And I go, cool, I've got a connection to you. You've got a connection to Joe. I've got to we've got to have capacity in those channels. You've got to have enough money in your channel to pay that to Joe, for example. And I don't have any visibility into that. When we talk about longer routes, it gets a lot harder, right? Kind of go, can I find somebody who's got enough money to pay into Joe? So if you could split the payment into small pieces, and yet Joe only gets it if he gets all the pieces. It's still all or nothing, but you can split it somehow. Then it lets you be much more flexible in the way you route payments. If something fails, you might try, let's try a smaller payment. Maybe that will work, and then I can pay the rest somewhere else. And that's called AMP. It's another Lightning contrived acronym, which is great.
Atomic multipath payment, right?
Thank you, atomic multipath payment. So and that again came out of the Lightning Labs team, and so we're probably going to finalize the way we do AMP. I imagine at the November meeting, and that's pretty exciting for us Lightning geeks. So there are other things that are further down the track. So Christian Decker of Blockstream came up with this idea called eltoo, ELTOO, and it is a more flexible variant of Lightning that we can do with a soft fork in Bitcoin that we hope will come through at some point. We probably won't spend too much time discussing that in November because it does require a Bitcoin change, and the timeline for that has to be, would it be at least 6 months before we can use it? So, that may be something that we look in like a 1.2 or a 2.0 spec, but probably won't feature heavily in November. Although I think that is incredibly exciting, and it's going to keep us employed for quite a while. But yeah, it's probably, we've got more than enough to discuss in the 2 days on sort of the just the things that we've learned from basically having the network working and how well that's working. And there's a whole heap of other minor protocol changes that we want to make. And so, yeah, so it'll be 2 get days of us sort of geeking out and then trying to. We won't complete the spec in that time, but we will definitely get a kickoff, and we'll get like a hit list of stuff that we really want in, and probably a list of things that we're going to push off again, which is what we did last time. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. Milan was really energizing, very intense, and the result of that was the Bolt standards, the 11 documents that came out of that, which several 100,000 words later. So we'll probably see a similar burst of verbiage come out of this time.
Very cool. What about another feature that I've heard of that people talk about is dual funding? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Okay. So dual funding. At the moment, the person who connects pretty much, the person who proposes the channel puts the money in, right? They also pay all the fees, by the way. They go, cool, I'll put the money in and I'll pay the fees. And in some ways that's fair, right? The person receiving it is like, well, there's no harm in me accepting the channel from you because it's not costing me anything, right? But there are many cases where you actually, and the problem with I set up a funnel, I set up a channel to you, and I fund it all. I put $100 in or whatever. You can't pay me with that channel now because, it's paying $100 to me and $0 to you, right? So you can't go, we'll pay -10 to me and pay $110 to you, right? You can't do that. So for a lot of scenarios, it makes sense for me to go, I want to open a channel, and go, cool. Well, I'll put $20 in, you put $80 in, and that way at least I'll be able to pay you $20 through the channel, right? It'll be a lot more balanced and things like that. There are a number of cases where you actually want both sides to fund the channel rather than just having one. The other way we could do it is splicing. We could start, one side starts with it all open, the other side, cool, but I want to splice this in. That's just a bit less efficient. So it does make sense to allow this case where you have this mutual negotiation. It was something that was cut from 1.0 of the spec because it was like, it was already getting pretty complicated. So definitely something that people want.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Another question I've got to ask you. Now, one of my prior guests, Nick Bhatia, so listeners, you can check out SLP episode 7. Now, he spoke about this concept of Lightning Network Reference Rate. And what he was talking about there was this concept of earning an interest rate on the Bitcoin that is staked, so to speak, or opened into a channel into a Lightning Network payment channel. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I found it fascinating because I'd never really thought of it in that way. I think it's wrong, but I do think it's interesting. So it's wrong, one, because you don't have visibility into all the money in the network. you do have public nodes. So nodes go, yes, here are my public channels. I advertise them so that you can use them to route, and you will pay me a small fee for it. But there are many channels that are not that are completely private, and they're only basically I use them for my own payments, but I don't really want anyone else to route through them, so they're just private to me, and so it's hard to scope the network that way. But you also end up with this dual funded case where you go, well, I'm on the network anyway because I want to make payments, but hey, I might as well route for other people because I'm up anyway, right? So the cost for doing that for me is zero. So the fee I'm going to charge is going to be almost zero, right? It's going to be as small as I can imagine. So what happens, I think, in real life is that fees drop to as close to zero as they can be. In fact, some people might just put zero fees in. They might just go, well, what the hell? In fact, there's argument that if you want someone to rebalance your channel, if you go, I really want, there's too much on one side of the channel, I really want to rebalance it, I should just advertise zero fees and let other people route through it in order to do that work for me. But certainly it's a race to the bottom on fees. And it should ideally be a question of the risk that is involved with running a node, right? So, how much do I worry about this node getting hacked? It's got these funds in it, because basically a Lightning node is a hot wallet, which is disturbing until you realize that anything that made Bitcoin more useful was going to increase risk. If you want to use your Bitcoin, it has to be in a hot wallet. So any technology that lets you use your Bitcoin means you're going to be in a hot wallet at some point. So so basically it should price in the risk of holding that Bitcoin and how much you value as Bitcoin. Unfortunately, we've learned that people are terrible at assessing risk. There is always somebody who will think they're smarter than you are, and they will judge their risk to be lower. So I'm pretty sure fees are going to zero. Maybe not technically zero, but very much in the noise on Lightning. So I think this idea that you will be able to make money by having a node that routes is wrong, because there'll always be someone who's even less risk averse than you are, who will try to undercut you, but also because there is enough economic activity and there are reasons for people to be on the network that don't involve them making fees of other people. So they will just suppress the price. And so while I think it's an interesting idea that you could measure this, I think in practice it's going to be more a technical decision of what is the minimum fee, non-zero fee that you can represent in the protocol. It's
fascinating.
Yeah,
fascinating. Yeah, I mean, and that you sort of touched on what my next question was going to be. I was actually combing through some of your documentation, and I found there's a C Lightning command called get route, and it actually incorporates a risk factor. And so, and in the documentation, it says, for example, if you thought there was a 1% chance that a node would fail and it would cost you 20% per annum, then the risk factor would be 20.
Yeah, so this is the delay, right? So what happens is if a node goes down halfway through, then you have to wait for the timeout. So I talked about how we chain payments, but the way that works in practice is I say to you, cool, if you get me the secret in the next 20 blocks, I'll make this payment. Otherwise the money's coming back to me. You turn around to Joe and go, cool, Joe, if you give me the secret in the next 10 blocks, then I'll give you the money. Otherwise, it comes back to me. Because you need to have time. If he gives you the secret right at the end of the window that you've given him, you have to have the time to turn around to me and get through to me and take the money off me, right? So there's this kind of staggered delay. So that means that if I talk to you and then you vanish off the network, I now have to wait 20 blocks before that's canceled, right? So there's this kind of, the risk is that somebody goes down at the wrong time and you have to wait to get your money back, and so you go, well, how much is my money worth? How long is that? And that's why fees on Lightning are proportional fees, right? Because it's like, how much is at risk and how long would it be, right? So that's the basis for fee charging, which interestingly is very different from Bitcoin, where Bitcoin is charged by weight. I like to think of the Bitcoin network as a courier who doesn't care what they're sending. They just care how much it weighs. So you can send $100 by a courier as like a $100 note, you're fine. You try to send it as 100 pennies, they're going to charge you a fortune. And the Bitcoin network works the same way. It's the weight of the transaction, number of inputs and outputs, and the size of the whole thing that they care about, not how much money is being transferred. Whereas in in Lightning, we care. Like it's actually proportional to the amount being spent, which is why Lightning makes sense for tiny, tiny payments because it's proportional, right? If you're sending a Satoshi through me, I'm going to charge you a tiny fee because, if things get stuck and I have to wait a day, it's 1 Satoshi. I don't care. A 10 to the minus eighth of a Bitcoin. So that's why Lightning is so nice for tiny, tiny payments. And it doesn't make so much sense when you get really big payments. One, because you've got to find the channel capacity that you can route that through all these people, right? And the bigger it is, the fewer channels you've got to choose from. But also because the fees are proportional, right? At some point, it'll be cheaper just to use a damn Bitcoin transaction. So there's this natural kind of sort of cohabitation where you get Bitcoin up here and you get Bitcoin via Lightning down here. So I think that's worth pointing out as well.
Yeah, sure. One other point I just wanted to clarify a little bit from the discussion earlier around the risk factors. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that is due to what we might call the cascading nature of the hash time lock contracts on a multi-hop sort of journey. Is that the reason?
Yeah, it's because you have to basically the time will drop across every node that you're sending. So you're sending through 20 nodes, and each one has decided they want like a 5-block window between them offering money to the next hop and then being able to accept it from the hop behind them. So they you want to make sure there's a bit of a gap, right? Because the way it actually works is they pay out before they connect. They receive the funds from behind them, right? They've got to make sure there's enough time there that they can do that. So they all incorporate a little bit of buffer there, right? That, of course, is cumulative across the hops. So if you're at the end, that's kind of the worst case. You end up waiting the longest in the absolute disaster case. You basically just multiply how likely do you think that is to happen by how much you think it would cost you to have those funds tied up. And that's the risk factor in the get route. And it basically takes that into account and goes, okay, well, that node's actually asking for a really long delay, but it's a really small fee. So, you have to figure out what's the time value of your money in order to make that decision on which way you route your payments.
Right, sure. That's fascinating. Yeah, it's really good. Thanks for the explanation on that. Okay. Well, I think they're pretty much the key points I had on Lightning. The next area that I was keen to ask you about is around development and development practices. Now, Rusty, you come from the Linux kernel development world, and now you're involved with Bitcoin and Lightning. Do you have any thoughts on how the programming and development culture differs?
Yeah, so at the root, when you talk to developers, is very much the same sort of open source culture that has been shaped a lot by the Linux kernel culture, but almost every project uses a very similar methodology, similar tools, similar thought processes on how and why you would do this. I mean, when I started my career sort of in 97, really full-time as an open source programmer, that was really weird. It was actually it was more understandable to be a full-time open source programmer. At least I was being paid a normal salary. But why you would volunteer to hack on random things was not the norm at the time. It was seen as really unusual. There wasn't a clear model of why you would do this. How would you make money out of open source was such a common question. And now it's become pretty much the norm. People hack on this stuff, 1, because it's fun, 2, because they develop a network, and 3, because it can turn into an employable activity and stuff like that. So it's definitely in the interest of programmers to collaborate on these projects. Also, collaborating with a group of intelligent peers is always a fascinating experience, and you learn a lot. So those norms tend to be across almost every open source project, and certainly the Bitcoin project and the kernel project very much similar in those ways. One of the differences is that from sort of a surface point of view, you go, well, Linus is in charge of the kernel. He's like he's the big boss, and it's very clear. And there is no big boss of Bitcoin, for example. But on a day-to-day level, it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference because in practice, there are maintainers who look after specific parts of the Linux kernel, and they're whichever one you're working on, they're the person you're going to be interacting with and going, and submitting patches to and getting feedback from. I was dealing with the very core part of Linux, the module subsystem, so I was dealing directly with Linus sometimes. But pretty much, he would leave you on your own, and unless something blew up, you would be left to to your own devices. So it wasn't as sort of centralized as that may seem. So there are definitely a lot of similarities in the way the projects work. There's also a lot of similarities in the sort of the early days of Linux and just the it was a toy, right? Nobody took it seriously. It was never gonna, there were the true believers who thought, it was going to take over the world, and there was the rest of the world who really didn't take it seriously at all. And you very much see that in kind of the Bitcoin project. A lot of kind of misunderstanding of what Bitcoin developers are trying to do. And so that's kind of a fascinating thing for me, because when I joined Linux, it was very much the crazy long-haired hippies trying to do this stuff. They're never going to take over from the dominant players in computing, and obviously that happened. So there's more. Certainly, it's probably one of the most widely deployed operating systems on the planet, given all the Android phones out there, certainly, that run Linux. So, we kind of won. And what's interesting there is that that's not the way most Linux developers thought we were going to win, right? They thought that, it was going to be the year of the Linux desktop from 1999 and almost every year afterwards. It's like, when's it going to be the year of the Linux desktop, right? When are we going to take on Microsoft? And it was always this assumption that the purpose of Linux was to basically be a better Windows. And that never happened, right? You may notice Microsoft's still in business. Windows is still a thing. And yet it was incredibly successful on devices that didn't even exist back when the Linux project started. I think that's a really important lesson. It's very hard to predict the future like that. When you've got some interesting technology, it may just, route around existing technologies. The idea that Bitcoin will kill Visa is one of these things that I think, hold on, I've seen this tale before and it doesn't end how you expect. So, I think so there are these elements definitely like in the Bitcoin project. But, I think one of the things that I did when we started with, the collaboration in the Lightning side particularly was look at both the Linux ecosystem and the Bitcoin ecosystem particularly and say, we want to deliberately set out to make something that's much more inclusive, much more friendly, much more collaborative than certainly, there was some sort of, bad blood in the Bitcoin space at the time. And it was like, hey, we kind of want to try to avoid that if we can. And so I think you'll find like the Lightning development community particularly, we had the advantage of being much smaller, of course, having not having the same level of pressure on us, but we're extremely collaborative. And, everyone gets along extremely well. And a number of people have remarked to me, coming into the development community, just how much, how nice everyone is to each other. And that was something that we explicitly highlighted as something that we want, because, we want to work on this stuff, I expect to be working on this stuff still in 10 years, right? So I want it to be a nice place to work. And so that is one thing that we've kind of tried to deliberately cultivate on the Lightning side. And I think so far, touch wood, we've done pretty well.
Yeah, that's some great insight into Bitcoin and particularly Lightning development. How about the recent news on the Linux Code of Conduct and the supposed, the diversity contrasted with meritocracy? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is a debate that's been going on at least 10 years in sort of the open source community and things like that. As we realize that on the surface everything's a meritocracy and everything else, but there are certainly advantages for certain people in a meritocracy. In this sort of pure meritocracy, in practice, I think it is, people have unconscious biases that I do think play into that. And even though they might think that they're operating purely for technical reasons and everything else, we know that people are biased in various ways, and that can accumulate. So the idea that you should compensate for that has been one of these bigger questions that's been over projects like the Linux kernel. From my point of view, certainly the Linux community, we're building a product that we hope will eventually be used by a massively broad range of people. And we're making design decisions, we're making protocol decisions and stuff now that affects them without them even knowing it, right? So we're making assumptions about how people are going to use this and what their priorities are, that are going to be baked into the system and kind of hard to change. So I think just from that point of view, the more diverse input we have at this early formative stage, the better fit that is going to be for what people actually want to do. I remember somebody saying to me that trying to explain, sound money, like why Bitcoin is so important to an American, is like explaining water to a fish. If you've got money that works almost all the time and hasn't had, major inflation collapses and everything else, you don't understand why these things are important. And I think we kind of it's easy to kind of fall into that trap of having of making assumptions about how things will be used because you have a very fixed small experience. And I think getting a broader set of viewpoints in is really, really critical. And just saying we're a meritocracy and basically just continuing to interact with only people the same as yourself doesn't get you there. So it is something that I think is, certainly I've become more aware of in my work in the last 10 years. And I think this is seeping through to different people. This is actually an important thing that doesn't just happen. But from a personal point of view, I'm always kind of horrified that geeks generally were these people who weren't treated well in school and they were kind of the outcasts and everything else. And surely this should be the last group of people who are going to then turn around and form their own clique and not let other people in for random reasons. So, I think we have an obligation. If anybody basically really wants to work on Lightning and stuff like that, my job is to help them. And I feel really strongly that the number of people have given me breaks and given me assistance when I probably didn't deserve it. Or they didn't think, I certainly didn't have the experience to justify the amount of time that they spent on me. And so I feel, when somebody comes along and they want to be part of the community and they're and they have something to add, it's really important that we, on the one hand we milk that, but also that we encourage that and that we, treat them with the kind of respect that we were treated when we came in, that helped us stay. So, as I said, this is a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and it's interesting to see that Linus has finally kind of come around perhaps to this view that there is some import in this, and I think different people are at different points of that progression.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, that's been it's been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it, Rusty. Where can everyone find you online, and do you have any other projects or things that you want the listeners to come and find you at?
Right. So usually people follow me at RustyTwit, at Rusty_twit on Twitter, and that usually just shouts out to my Medium blog and things like that. But I'm usually around on sort of various media, but Twitter's usually the best way to follow along with the Lightning stuff. I guess I want to emphasize that we're still in the early days of this, right? There are still proposals come forward and go, wow, I didn't know we could do that. That's actually really cool. And I think that's what keeps us so exciting and keeps everyone kind of jazzed about this. This is definitely something that is looking at the adoption that we're seeing and how positive everything is going at the moment, I feel has got a huge future in front of it. And I think, it's an incredibly exciting thing to get involved in.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm really excited myself as well. All right. Well, I think that's pretty much it. Thanks very much, Rusty. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, that was my conversation with Rusty Russell. I hope you guys enjoyed that discussion on the economic eras of Bitcoin. And if you're interested, you can find the links for this on the show notes page. Go to my website, stefanlivera.com. That's STEPHANLIVERA.com. Search SLP23 and you can find all the links related to this episode. We also discussed the Lightning Network and some of the coming advances. And also, if you like this episode, you may be interested in some of the earlier episodes, such as episode 9 with Brian Vu, the VP of Product at Lightning Labs, and also episode 7 with Nick Bhatia. Otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. If you got value out of it, please do share it on social media, as that really helps me out. That's it from me, guys. Thanks, and I'll speak to you next time.